cloud. Hello and welcome to Pierce College's special event, a holistic discussion on criminal justice reform with Dr. Thaddeus Johnson. We do have a slideshow that's running. I want to go to the right slides if it'll let me to do part of our introduction. So Dr. Johnson, here's his wonderful picture. He's assistant professor of criminal justice and criminology, Georgia State University's Andrew Young School of Policy Studies. Also serves as a senior fellow with the Council on Criminal Justice. And I'm not going to read you everything that's on the slide. So those of you who are here had the opportunity to see that stuff anyway. But he's going to give us, I think, is going to be a fabulous presentation talking about criminal justice reform in our nation and the whole tie-in with regard to race relations and police community relations and all that great stuff. I saw him do a similar presentation for, was that San Diego State? Was that college? Or University of California, San Diego. I don't know which one it was, but fantastic presentation. So I'm looking forward to a great night. And I want to thank you all for joining us. I'm going to hand off to Dr. Johnson.
Oh my God. Thanks so much, Frank. I appreciate you. Thank you to Pierce College and everybody for inviting me. And thank you all for coming out this evening. It's 7 o'clock Eastern time. I know we're probably watching Wheel of Fortune by now. And so I'm just really, really elated that you all came out to join us to talk about what I feel like is a pretty important topic that, is really complex. I think in a lot of the national mainstream conversations, some nuances have been missing in this conversation. I also think that in the conversation when it talks about public safety and reform, that these options has been presented as if you have to make a choice between the two. And you don't have to fall for those false choices. And so there are ways to keep people safer, but also do it in an equitable and a more legitimized manner, right? And we all know the impacts of that. If the people believe systems are just, that they try their best to advocate for truth, that people will tend to report more crimes. People will tend to communicate with and comply when it comes to investigations. Our clearance rates are abysmal across the U.S. when it comes to homicides and violent crimes, oftentimes because people don't trust the police and we don't want to talk to the police. I came from one of those homes myself, growing up in South Memphis, Tennessee. Grow up, I had the talk about the justice system and reform. Being a young Black man growing up in a place that Dr. King lost his life. I also was a former police officer who left the job because everybody I arrested in Memphis either looked like me or had a similar background than I had. The first man that I arrested, his license was Dixie Street. That's the street behind my grandma's street. And so he was from the street behind where my grandma's house was at, that I played in the street, played basketball in the street. And so that kind of hit me a little bit differently. And Natasha Johnson, that's my wife, we met and we decided we wanted to do more. She worked in schools. And I remember the one time she worked in school that a student asked her a question at 13 about abortion. And the bell rang, and guess what? You got 45 other students coming in that need her as well. And so they kind of felt the same thing in policing, like we're making a change, but can we make a bigger change, or are we addressing it differently? And so that's kind of where we're at in our lives now. The things that I'll be presenting today, and let me go ahead and share my screen if I do this correctly. I think I did it correctly. Yep. So the things that I'm sharing today, this comes from our research that I've done since a doctoral student to this point now. Now, mind you, I did not come in here saying that I was going to look at violence. When I started doing this, I wanted to stay away from race stuff. I'm not going to be the Black guy with dreads, and I'm going to be the race scholar. I was like, I did not want that to happen. But as we started doing research in policing, research on school to prison pipeline, research on imprisonment, and research on artificial intelligence and criminal justice processing, we found that race mattered. Race really mattered. And what I started looking at, well, are these systems quote unquote racist? Or is there things going on in secularly or in society? And oftentimes the justice system plays the hand that they're dealt. And we'll talk about what I mean with that. We'll talk about, should we re-envision what we think about the criminal justice system if we want it to do all the things we want it to do? Because we have to remember at the end of the day, the criminal justice system was built as a blaming and punishing institution. And that we force police officers, correctional officers, and everyone else to be social workers without resourcing them to do so. And so what I want to talk about today is avoiding false choices. And let me tell you what the most pressing issue, at least in my opinion, today when it comes to criminal justice reform, is equity and effectiveness in curbing community violence. I'm going to unpack some things about how our justice system, when you think about its processing, the reforms that is passed, the statutory changes that's going on, our system is the fairest that it's been in the last 20 years. That does not mean everything is fixed. It does not mean that inequities are not there. But what it means is that we've shown the propensity to be able to reduce crime while we reduce prison populations and reduce disparities. And so what I want to kind of talk about is not only where we need to go, but kind of talk about where we've been. Because I think oftentimes we can be so cynical of the justice system that we don't talk about the improvements that's been made. And let me tell you, a lot of the findings in my work, look, a Black guy from Memphis, a police officer in Memphis, grew up to a father who had to go into the back door of the Orpheum because he couldn't enter in the front door, right? So all of these things in there, and I'm telling you, I had to wrestle against my own biases when I started seeing findings that disparities were decreasing and that there is the possibility to be effective and more fair when it comes to public safety. And so what I'm presenting to you all today is the analytical and empirical journey that I've kind of been on to get to this point about how can we move forward. I would even ask you a question that when we talk about parity and disparities in the justice system and the outcomes, given the backdrop of discrimination, these gaps when it comes to economics, education, policies like redlining, the fallout from the mass incarceration that ravaged Black communities, we're going to talk about that we're actually have kind of reversed the course. But there are spaces that we need to improve on. And honestly, those areas that need to improve on may be beyond the purview of the justice system. And so when I'm talking about criminal justice reform, you'll never hear me say things like intentionally like police reform and then community reform. Because what that says is that police and the justice system are not part of the community. That's gotten us in trouble. And so community reform with police and the justice system as part of that broader community. The places that are seeing the most reductions in inequities, the places that are seeing the most reductions in violent crime have taken a community-centered approach where you bring in other stakeholders, you bring in community members, and you all address this together because the truth be told, this issue is bigger than policing and it's bigger than us arresting our way out of these issues. You all are in Philadelphia. No, we're down here in Atlanta. And so I've been seeing the news and unfortunately, Philadelphia and the state of Pennsylvania has been a case study of sorts. Like for instance, let me tell you about Pennsylvania. In 2000, the drug imprisonment ratio was 40-1 for Blacks to whites. Today is around 5-1. And so what we've been unpacking, what's been going on in these places. And so I think Pennsylvania and Philadelphia are prime examples of you can make these investments, you can try these things in the justice system, but you start realizing we got to make investments in other part of our society if we want to see these impacts flow through the justice system, if that makes sense. So what I'm going to do today is just I'm going to show slides because this is a topic where hopefully I'll say some things to kind of make you wrestle with your own presumptions, maybe it rubs you the wrong way, and maybe we can have a conversation about it. But let me tell you that everything that I do is embedded in data, embedded in theory, because it's one of those things that we have to put evidence first, right? We have people's lives at stake, people's equity at stake, and we have to move from opinion and move toward evidence. And oftentimes the evidence, look, we need more data, we need better data, we need this, but we have tools and resources to give us insights on what's working, what's not working, and where do we need to address. So for me, that's really the purpose of today's conversation. I know I'm showing a lot of slides, but as I told Frank, I will make these slides available in PDF form after the presentation. Has links and different things so you can know I'm not making this stuff up, right? I always tell my students, make sure you challenge the information that's presented to you. Make sure you do your own homework. Make sure that you know the credentials of people that stands before you, right? And so in order for me to exude that, I practice transparency, okay? And the same data that I got from, anybody can go and download these sources because to me, that's how you really understand what's going on. So let me shut up and keep moving. So I want to take this, I'm probably going to talk about 40, 45 minutes, and I want to save time for you all to talk to me, ask questions. And mind you, this is not me teaching you all. We all are learning from each other, right? And so that's one reason why I'm really looking forward to it. So in part one, we're going to discuss the racial disparity trends in justice processing from 2000 to 2020. That's pretty much what the data allows us to look at. In part two of this, we're going to talk about, as a Black man, what's been hard for me to talk about, but I had to embrace it because the data shows it. And in my heart, I know it's the truth, and we need to have this conversation. There's differential offending and victimization in our communities that often leads to some of the disparities that we see in our justice system, particularly when it comes to violence. And I'll show you some of the data that we have that we can pretty much show that, hey, property crimes and processing, drug processing, that was discriminatory. But when it comes to violent offending, the justice system plays the hand they're dealt. And these things really come to a head and show how systemic inequities can really have impacts on people's lives and entire communities. And so if we want to address violence long-term, we have to, as an American society, say that certain offenders and victims are redeemable, that they're worth investing in, that certain communities are worth salvaging is the wrong word, but making investments in and revitalizing. And so we have to ask some hard questions. When we start talking about how long is long enough to lock up people who've committed violent offenses, we have to start asking ourselves these hard questions. And so hopefully we can touch on these things this evening. So let me start here real quickly. Let me just talk about where we've been in our justice system. Now, these are state imprisonment trends from 2000, and this is 2019. I did not include 2020 because we saw a big drop in admissions in population because of the pandemic and early releases of things like that. However, the disparity remained pretty much the same. It was a proportionate decrease in the number of people in prison during the pandemic years. So on the left-hand side, these are the disparity ratios. I calculated the disparity ratio by taking the black adult rate of 100,000 adult rate. So it's the number of Black people per 100,000 adults who are incarcerated. That rate was divided by the white rate, and that gave us a disparity ratio. So you see a ratio that says, like the very first one for the green line for drugs on the left-hand side of 15. That means that the rate of in 2000 of Black people being incarcerated for drugs was 15 times the imprisonment rate of white people at that time. All right, and if you look across through 2020, you'll start seeing that drugs is now not the most problematic area when it comes to imprisonment disparities. You see that when it comes to property crimes, which is at the bottom of the red line, remain kind of flat but decreased. You see the public order kind of remained the same over the last 10 years or so. But as you'll see, the biggest decrease was for drug offending, but the largest remaining gap that we have in state imprisonment is for violent offending. Mind you, 2/3 of the prisoners in state prison are there for violent offenses. And they're serving longer periods now than they have over the past 20 years. So remember I told you that the justice system is a punishing and blaming institution? It is, and we do it very well. What we're finding is now they're starting to do it more equitably, or treating Black people and white people more alike when it comes to particularly post-arrest. We can have a whole conversation about state reports on how states moved away from mandatory minimums for drug offenses and reestablished mandatories and enhancements for gang activity and violent crime and things like that. And so there's a whole slew of things that could explain that. And if you also look on the right-hand side, I will move on, but you'll see with the blue line, from about 2010, definitely, we've seen a steady decline in the Black imprisonment rate. And mind you, these are on two different axes. So even though the Black imprisonment rate is declining, on the left-hand side, the very top axis is 1,200, a rate of 1,200 per 100,000, whereas for white people, it's a rate of 165 per 100,000. So still, mind you, even though the disparity is decreasing, that level is still a little bit higher when it comes to race relations. All right. This is just some backdrop. Now, this is the part that kind of gets me in trouble, but hopefully it doesn't, because what it does, it points out that we have answers. So remember, I told you that the biggest gap in imprisonment is for violent offending. Well, when we start looking at, first of all, the first stage of the justice system process is what? An offense, but let's just start with arrest. Well, what we're seeing is, if you look on the right, on the left-hand side, you'll see the disparity in non-fatal violent offender rates. This is from the NCVS data. You'll see that this rate, the disparity rate, is increasing. It increased from about 3 to 1 in 2000 to about 4 to 1, right? The defending non-lethal violent offender rates of Black people compared to white people. But look on the right-hand side. At some point down here, you see that around 2016, 17, the line for arrest, and then you see the line for offending, these things converge. And statistically, what it's telling us is that the disparities that we see in arrests are associated with disparities in offending and victimization. Now, this has been a hard conversation for some people to digest. And it's not an easy conversation as a Black guy to come up here and say, listen, we took it on the head when it comes to, on the nose when it comes to property crimes and drug offending imprisonment. But we have a role when it comes to violent offending. And until we're able to digest this and talk about it, and if we want to brush this under the rug, then the people who need help the most will never get it. And so this is the purpose for really covering this, right? That we have to find ways outside of arrest to influence violent offending if what we really want is parity in our justice system. Now, mind you, when the pandemic came, oh, violent crime is rampant. Oh, it's getting the highest it's been since the 90s and all these things. You hear all these things. But for Black folk, this wasn't new news. If you look at this at the homicide victimization rates, the top line, the blue line, is the Black rate. The white line, the orange line is the white rate. Across this time, Black people were about 5 to 6 times more likely to be homicide victims than white people. And if you look in 2020, when we hit the pandemic year, it jumped up to almost 7. Mind you, victims and offenders tend to look alike, be of the same race, and oftentimes of the same gender, even though you have these things. Also, crimes generally does not occur between strangers. There is some type of affiliation, all right? And so let me make sure I make this clear too. This does not mean that Black people are inherently violent. This does not mean that Black people are evil to the core. What this means is that they've been victims of systemic inequities that breed these conditions. We know for social disorganization, we see it in all the affordable housing literature, there are certain systemic inequities that contribute to the crimes that we see. And what we've been doing is trying to arrest our way out of it. But as I will tell you later, you have to arrest, and incarceration only temporarily stops offending. It only temporarily protects the community. And we have to, what when they come out? People who go to prison, guess what? They're coming back home. And oftentimes they're coming back home with nothing but the clothes on their back to the same conditions that contributed to where they're at right now. Isn't this insanity? Right? And so this whole purpose is, how can we place a dent and cut off and disrupt that cycle through community investments, through intelligence-driven policing? Those are the two hands that we can do this at. Now, mind you, yes, I showed you the offending rates when it comes to victimization and offending and the disproportionalities, but this is not evenly distributed across the entire Black race. Now, mind you, Black women suffer from violence. And what I'm not doing is trying to minimize or discount what other people and other groups are facing. However, we have to prioritize, right? The economics of governance. We want to address everything, but we don't have all the money and resources to do so. So you need to address what is the most salient. And this is why I'm focusing on this. Now look at this. 11,000 Black men were killed in 2021 from homicide, lost their lives. About 7,500 of those were those Black men 15 to 34 years old. If you look at the ratio of their rate of this group compared to the white male counterparts rate of the same age group, look at it. 15 to 19-year-old Black men are almost 32 times more likely to be a firearm homicide victim or a homicide victim than their white counterparts. If you look on the right-hand side, if a young Black, and I'm going to talk about gun violence today because this is pretty endemic right now, because look, for Black men of this age group, if they're a victim of a homicide, a gun was probably involved, more likely involved than not. So that means to me, perhaps we should start addressing what leads to this gun carrying behavior. What's underlying the root of it? Because if we think we're going to do cookie cutter stuff, and that same stuff is going to work on every group and every person, and somebody tells you that, they're selling you snake poison, get up and run. All right? That's not realistic. And this is the data that you can get from the CDC that shows us not making these things up. Okay? Let me keep it moving. Now, mind you, for white men in the same age group, it's around 75 to 80% of homicide deaths involve a firearm. So it's not pretty for them either. But when we start talking about getting close to 100%, it raises a few eyebrows. So let me just stop real quickly and let's just kind of talk about community gun violence, because we just had the incident in Maine, the sad, tragic incident that happened in Maine that's still active, right? And I think it's important that we realize that we have to separate different types of gun violence, because different types of gun violence will require different types of intervention, all right? So, mind you, the gun deaths have dropped since 2020. In 2021, they dropped. We're seeing the same conditions for 2022 and some early analyses. But they're still much higher than the 2019 level. And again, community violence tends to be highly concentrated and unevenly distributed across race and place. Let me tell you this. Only about 4% of the landmass, the geographic area in the US has been impacted by gun violence. So we know where it's occurring. In places like Philadelphia, 1% of the entire population was responsible for 60 to 70% of the serious crimes that we saw. So we know who's doing it, and we know where it's occurring. So what this tells me, if you have a police department that's practicing stop and frisk, it's for show, and you're just trying to catch fish in the net, it's not evidence-based, and it's not effective, and it's not a good use of staffing, particularly under the midst of a staffing crisis. And the last thing is, young Black males tend to be the leading victims and the offenders. Now, I know many of you all probably already know these things, but I think it's important to really set this groundwork. Now, let's talk about the 4 different types of gun violence, even though we're going to focus on community gun violence, and then we'll talk about how we address it. So mind you, over half of gun deaths are suicides or accidents, right? That's a problem that we're not talking about here, right? But that's a big problem, right? Also, over 50% of homicides are caused by gun violence, but we saw the rate of young Black men and the gun involvement for homicides far outpaces the overall for the population. Then, you have issues about domestic gun violence. And I'm not talking about that either, because that's hard to police. But the one thing people don't talk about is, you see these things declining or increasing in the pandemic. Nobody talks about what's going on with domestic violence. In places like Georgia, we saw it tick up during the pandemic, but it did not make one news report. But so it's other forms of violence that I'm not talking about today. And thinking about now these mass shootings, it's only about 2% of all homicides and 1% of all deaths. The issue with these shootings is that they're shock the conscience of society. And these are the types of crimes that make people live in fear, even though they're extremely rare. And the fear of crime, look at the 80s and 90s, it can dictate policies to impact generations of people. All right. Now, also, the one thing I want to talk about is that gun lethality. Whenever I talk about gun violence, people say, what about more stringent gun laws? More stringent gun laws are necessary, right? Because more guns in the streets It shows that more production of guns, more guns bought were associated with doing the increase of gun violence. I mean, it makes pretty things like common sense, but also it opens up new opportunities for the black gun market because people are fearful. They're carrying their weapons, people breaking their cars, they're not being capable guardians of their things. And now you increase the black market for guns when you increase the manufacturing, even though they may be sold legally. Most guns used in crimes are bought through a black market or legal means. So gun laws are important, but they are not the answer. Anybody tells you that, they're selling you venom as well. Now, real quickly, this is basically what I said earlier, what I described, but what I want you all to take a close look at, is the bottom one, defensive gun use. Between 19 and 22, the number of gun deaths from defensive gun use grew almost 91%. It dropped a little bit in 21, 22, but what it tells me is that our citizens are in conflict, and they are in conflict and armed. This is what it tells me. Beyond the gun violence, right? Citizens are taking upon themselves to protect themselves. Does that mean that people have less faith in the police? Is it because they understand there's a second crisis, need to arm themselves? Is it an increased fear of crime? All of these reasons may determine this. But what we're seeing is, to me, these numbers are scary, but becomes even scarier, though, is that citizens are arming themselves to protect themselves, and we saw these rates increase. Now, I kind of mentioned these things already in American cities about, the geography and who's responsible. But the one thing that I want to point out here is that most acts of gun violence are not random, and generally this gun violence tends to be extremely local and derived from beefs. Some work by Jerry Ratliff, a Philadelphia scholar who works with police quite often. His research showed that half of Philadelphia victims who were shot are shot within 2 blocks of their home. It also says that in Atlanta, we found that the vast majority of the gun violence we saw at clubs and other places of leisure spilled over from local beefs in neighborhoods. The beef didn't start in the club. The beef brought itself to the clubs, right? So these are things about gun violence that we need to make sure that we really understand before we even start talking about this is how we're going to intervene. Right? And so this is the type of approach that I like to take. So I painted the problem, right? There's a problem. There's an issue. And what's being done about it? Things are being done about it. Mind you, states have doled out millions of dollars. Pennsylvania is one of those states. Millions of dollars for community investment, community intervention to build a violent crime work group, but also taking an intelligence-driven approach when it comes to their policing. So these are some of the things that have been going on, right? The one thing that also has been going on is that states have been ratcheting up the sanctions and sentencing for violent offending, for enhancements for gang activity, and enhancements for firearms involved. They've ratcheted up these things. People are also serving longer periods behind bars, I said that earlier, for violent offending, and 2/3 of our state prisoners are there. 66%, 67 some change percent are there for violent offending. It's hard to get into prison for things other than violent offending. The others, usually repeat offenders, they save some room for human trafficking. They save room when it comes to drugs for methamphetamines and synthetics. But somebody with a weed possession, you're not gonna find many of those people in prison. It's usually there for violent offending or repeat offending. But this is why locking people up and throwing the key will not work and be sustainable. First of all, people tend to age out of crime. It's just the truth. Now, mind you, for young black men, it usually lasts a little bit longer, but people still tend to age out. So if you lock somebody up for 20 years, they're probably not going to reoffend, not because they're benevolent and they've changed. They're just too damn old to do these things, right? And so this is things that we don't talk about. Also, remember, a relatively small share of individuals are responsible for disproportionate amount of crimes. And then lastly, the replacement effect. And I always kind of joke about this, but think about it. If we don't deal with the conditions that breed or burst gang leaders or dope boys and drug offenders, locking up the gang leader or the dope boy is not going to do anything. In fact, if I'm the dope boy who's a competition, thank you, Mr. Police. Thank you, Mr. Prosecutor. You arrested them. You took away my competition. And I still have a market there for my product without competition. And so simply locking people up and throwing away the key will not resolve things. It protects citizens temporarily from these offenders. It provides a symbolic form of solace to victims and communities, but some research even shows that that's not enough for victims and survivors. They want people to be held accountable, but they want to see deeper things done. They realize that locking this person up for 100 years at some point is not going to bring back my family member or loved one. How can we prevent this cycle from going on? And you see this in victim advocacy groups who are turning and asking for not necessarily shorter sentences, but asking for rehabilitation and mercy for some of these violent offenders. And so we're seeing a public, a social pulse that's saying we have to hold violent offenders accountable, but people are starting to understand that we need a system that sees the beauty in salvaging people's lives and not destroying their lives, right? And so this is why I say that we can enforce and we can hold people accountable. We need to, but we have to do more than that if we want to see our grandkids. I always say, wouldn't it be a shame if Pierce College 30 years from now had another one of these sessions and our grandkids are here and we're having the same conversation? That means that we have failed them because we're having the same conversation about what can be done. I don't want to be that guy. So there are several things that the police are doing right now to really reduce crime. And we've seen a lot of good effects when it comes to the role of police, right? So it's an intelligence-driven and community-informed strategies that are balanced. This is what we need. We just don't need all of these stop and frisk. Now, mind you, again, gun violence is concentrated, so focused strategies are the most effective. Community gun violence responds to both rewards and punishments, and we'll talk about that when it comes to focused deterrence. And also, community gun violence thrives in the presence of injustice and unfairness. Basically, if certain communities, particularly those most impacted by violent crime, feel like the justice system is not fair, they don't have confidence in it, they're less likely to comply with the law, less likely to cooperate when it comes to, to cooperate when it comes to investigations or being witnesses, because they don't feel the justice system can protect them. And so they don't feel the justice system is fair. We also know that oftentimes when you see police have to use violence or deadly force, or they use deadly force, there's some resistance sometimes that comes before, and people say, well, why Black folks just don't comply? Well, if we don't trust, and there's a history of systemic inequity and abuse, it's not simply defiance that we're seeing people who are fearful. We see people who are afraid for their lives, right? We see people who feel like they're not going to get a fair shake. And so that doesn't provide an excuse, but it provides the reality of which we're working in. And if we're working in a certain reality, that means we need to approach things differently. I want to go on into all these type of approaches. I really want to talk about the place-based approaches, because I want to talk about the things that the justice system can do, because even the things I'm talking about, this is beyond the justice system. Like, for instance, the justice system can't decide where we need to build affordable housing at. I mean, hell, even the justice system can't say, oh, this place is not well lit, we need to cut on these lights. The police department can't do that. And so what I'm talking about is a whole of government approach to public safety, where you use the expertise of the police, the expertise of nonprofits. Now, mind you, the stuff that I'm talking about, people are already doing these things. They're doing it, though, with scarce resources. They're doing these things without a lot of limelight and media coverage, right? What we're seeing, even the stuff that we're seeing with these things when it comes to imprisonment, laws were passed, but laws were passed after changes happened, meaning that law cemented what people on the ground were already doing. So it's not like the law was innovative. And so when it says this work is going on, we just got to bolster it and make it a little bit more effective and concentrated. So these are things that you all are familiar with. Hotspots policing, see at 7:42, I want to be done by 8. Hotspots policing place networks investigations, and focus deterrence. Now, it's easy for me to say, oh, if the department's got crime mapping data, that's great. Now you can kind of focus on not only the places, but the times as well, too. Places like Dallas use hotspots policing, where they concentrate police resources in the places that show they tend to have a higher risk for criminality and crime. Places like Dallas said, oh, we have to hold people accountable, yes, but these people are struggling, suffering, and we need to bring in service providers. We need to take a holistic approach to this, because many of the things are beyond the justice system and doesn't require arrest. That's why Dallas, when the pandemic hit, they didn't see those fluctuations that many other places got, because they had put the work in and they had already laid the groundwork. And so they saw a spike, but it wasn't as severe as we saw in other places because they took this approach. They also took a co-responder approach, where you have a substance abuse or mental health call, and they had co-responders, social workers and service providers, partner with plainclothes officers to go what we're talking about, a non-enforcement element, a thing that needs to require police for safety and support, but they're not the ones who should be at the front of these transactions and these interactions. They did that. They saw great success with it. They had to fight for it. Even though it worked, they had to fight for funding for it. And so even in places that things are working, the evidence is there, they still have to fight for funding for it to continue. And so I'm talking all this stuff, all these answers to the world's problems, but at the end of the day, you need political will. In places like Cincinnati, they took this approach, though motivated by a federal investigation. They saw decreases in officer use of force, decreases in arrests, citizens felt better about police, officers were less likely to be assaulted, and they kept it for about a decade. They lost the political will. They lost it. And guess what happened? Things tended to go back downhill. So a lot of these things that I'm talking about is going to require for our local leaders and state leaders to be courageous, to go against the grain, and really, really show more than symbolic and performative that every community matters. Every community, every person can be redeemed. And these are the things that have been kind of roadblocks to how we do things. And also, when I talk about crime mapping and technology, you got to have the officers who are trained for it. Look, I know how it goes, in particular in small departments. Oh, you can use social media. You're going to be the person to input our data. Oh, you got to input data. Oh, you're going to be our person to kind of read the data and figure out how we do these things, right? But you got to have the computing power. You got to have the skilled people to do so. You got to have the staffing to do so. Are you going to pull a person off the street with the staffing issues right now and put them in these positions? It means we need to find room for civilians who are maybe not non-sworn, who has expertise that can help affect public safety. So let me lay my hat real quickly, though, on, when it comes to focused deterrence. Now, I know we hear people talking about focused deterrence oftentimes, right? It's one of those things that's kind of thrown out there as being the preeminent strategy, but it's one of the strategies we have the most evidence on. That's why you hear talk about it the most. And remember, we're taking the evidence-based approach. And this is an approach where police and citizens work together. So what I like about this is the fact that what you'll have is focused deterrence offers targeted individuals two choices. And you have these call-ins. You bring the pastor, you bring that grandmother who knows, Miss Jenkins, who knows everything that goes on. You bring the probation officer and parole. You bring other community leaders in there and say, listen, we know what you're doing. You're selling all the dope. You're running these gangs and these crews. We know it's you, but we're going to give you two choices. You continue to engage in this behavior, and we're going to prosecute you to the fullest extent. Or you disengage, and here's the evidence we have against you. It's like, we have a case against you. Or you can disengage from this problematic behavior, and we will connect you to the services that you need. This has been highly successful because it's not just police, it's a community. And they're on one accord, and they're a united front. And we've seen these things really work. The problem is, they're not necessarily these large-scale things, or you see these big sweeping trains like you can do. You see like stop and frisk sweeps and these types of things. It's not as sexy, or it doesn't show, it's not a performative way of reducing crime. And so oftentimes these things may not be, so popular or sexy when it comes to the different types of strategies. But this just kind of goes to show some of the evidence, and you have links you all can click on here. But we've seen these things like Operation Ceasefire, the Boston Gun Project is maybe one of the more famous ones. Chicago Project Safe, right? And it includes prosecutors and all these people, right? And what it shows is that in cities like Boston and New Orleans, now mind you, because it's necessarily this is effective in a urban center, it may not be the same in a rural center, and we need to be mindful of this. So when I'm talking about our principles and not particularly strategy themselves, we take the principles from this and we apply these things because there is no cookie cutter approach, right? And so we have many studies on this, and pretty much what it finds is that it impacts crime and it reduces crime without having a displacement effect. All right. So this is just one method that I tend to like to talk about. That's a method that utilizes community police, but utilizes intelligence from probation and parole officers, from crime mapping and other intel sources, informants, right? So this is one of these things where everything comes to a head to get us to this point. And we've seen great impacts with this type of work. Now, mind you, what time is it? Good. There are also non-enforcement initiatives. Now, mind you, you can't just have one approach. You got to have a multi-layered approach where, mind you, many of the things that you'll see about focused deterrence or many of these other strategies that you see when we talk about reducing violent crime, these have both immediate, like for instance, these violent workforces, right, that I'm talking about, like Chicago Ready, they break up short-term and mid-term violent acts and violent incidents. Not much for long-term, because guess what? That environmental backcloth is still there. So you have to move beyond these programs, which have shown to be successful. You have the Reddish Violence Program, Intervention Program in Chicago, where they find those who are at greatest risk or former victims of gun violence, and they provide holistic services. And you see people who in these 2 years after being in these programs, they're still safe, they're still working, gun violence is reduced. You have the ROCA program in Baltimore, program that also works with the police. And the same thing, they work with those who are most at risk, connect them with services, cognitive behavioral therapy, provide these supports, right? You know, it's funny, you know, we talk about, and I was doing a study on robbery recidivists, and they were using the term reentry. Like, how the hell can we have somebody who's reintegrated when they've been socially excluded from the first place? And so we have to get to that type of thinking if we want to see improvements, not today, not tomorrow, but for our grandkids. And then you also have the hospital-based programs where at Grady Hospital, someone comes in with a gun wound, a gun injury. And you know what happens is they know that there might be some retaliation. They go in and they figure out who their friends are. They go in and find out, try to figure out who they had beef with. And they intervene right there in the hospital, right there. So these are programs that we found to be effective, but all of these programs are communities or subsets communities working with the police. Now, two things that I want to talk about that shows why we have to make community investments and move beyond these things. I love cognitive behavioral therapy, but it's not a miracle worker. I love these other processes, but they cannot work miracles, right? So what's the realistic life thing that we're dealing with? In Black communities, particularly these young Black men that I talked about, you have this allure of the street life. The street life, mind you, people come from areas that people view as nothing. They're told that they're not nothing. They're told that they see what the trajectory looks like from them based on others around them. So how do you have self-confidence? How do you build identity? How are you not in a perpetual state of wanting to commit suicide and harm yourself? And I guess some would say getting involved in this is a quasi way of doing that, self-mutilation. I get that, right? But in this, you know, we talk about deterrence and all these things, but these things are for people who think rationally. If your identity is caught up in you not being the bitch on the street, if your identity is not you being a sucker on the street, if your identity is wrapped in who can be the biggest, who can be the baddest, right? Who can party the most? Who can make the most money? If you're male, or who can get the most women or the most dates? Who can do these things? You're not thinking rationally, because this is part of your identity. This gives you a status. And so it's this hedonistic pursuit, this ended pursuit of illicit action that feeds into itself that we're not talking about. The code of the street and gun violence. When we saw John Morant, I was this billionaire doing all these. I wasn't surprised, because he comes from those conditions. You know, these things just don't die overnight because you've made it into whatever the American dream that we call the American dream. Those ties run deep. And it's a mindset and mentality that's hard to break, particularly among our young men. And also, violence is seen as currency. Violence is not seen as violence in itself. It's a sense of currency for status and identity. Then you have, now I'm going to kind of move on, but without access to education or being pessimistic about job opportunities, what are you going to turn to? You feel like you have no other choice. You're not thinking rationally. And so we have to make these investments. Even things like gun and weapon carrying. Now, for Black people carrying guns, it lies in the history of Jim Crowism and slavery and home protection and all those things, but it has evolved. And if you kind of go and you look for a survey, this is a research done in Brooklyn, New York, where they asked, why do you carry weapons? Because they fear dying. They fear that someone's going to hurt them or run into opposition. I grew up in South Memphis as an honor student. I carried a box cutter on the bus across town because you're not going to steal my shoes or rob a bomber jacket. I'm going to protect myself, right? And so this is part of the culture that we have to realize is there. And that it's about protection and not that we want to go kill. Right now, you have some bad characters out there. I'm not saying that, but I'm talking about the common case and the redeemable cases that are more vulnerable or more susceptible to interventions working, right? These individuals who I'm talking about. Now, I kind of mentioned this about the social exclusion, but the crime of the American dream, picket house on the fence, a house on the hill with a picket fence, you know, 1.5 or 2/3 kids, however it works out, right? All those things. Well, this is a dream or achievement that some people would never make. And if they can make it, it's a block in their head that they never can. And so again, it makes your thinking irrational. Can you imagine a life where you're pessimistic about your future outcomes? Can you imagine a life where tomorrow doesn't matter because to you it's definitely not promised? So if we want to, that 1% I'm talking about, we're going to have to keep it real in the reality that we're dealing with if we really want safer communities. And I think what happened with the pandemic, some of these crimes that just took place in the hood kind of bled out in other areas and people started paying attention. But these things have been going on despite the historic crime drop that we've seen through the 90s and 2000s. So it's 7:55. I have a couple more slides. I will be done in 10 minutes because I want to hear from you all because I've talked a whole hell of a lot. All right. So when I talk about reform and community reform, this is why I use that term. That backdrop has to be cleaned up. There's no way to have long-standing, sustainable public safety if we don't clean up that backdrop. I mean, and I personally don't see how it's possible, right? And so this is a place in Atlanta that's a prime example of the type of approach we need to take, called Eastlake. This is not politically correct, but we're all family. They used to call it Little Vietnam because they called it a war zone in the 70s, 80s, early 90s. The police did not even want to go over there. Poor performing schools, food deserts, horrible housing conditions. A developer, now this is why public-private partnerships are the way of community and justice reform. Developer came in, worked with nonprofits, worked with the federal government, worked with the police department, and they rebuilt the housing development. Now they have housing development that's sprawling over there. They have a charter school, which is one of the better schools in the city of Atlanta. Hell, they have a golf course where Tiger Woods just came a couple years ago and played the PGA tournament. You have Publicis and different grocery stores there. You have affordable housing, market rate housing. You have an area that has vitality there. But this is a 10-year process. And I love what they say, if the water is clean, the fish will be fine. And too many of our reforms focus on giving people fish and not teaching them how to fish. Or they know how to fish, not provide them with the resources so they can catch their own fish, right? But this is the issue that we need to focus on. Make sure we invest in both places and people, because overnight, East Lake became whiter and more educated. It's about 22% of the people who were there before they started that we have no idea where they're at or what happened. And so, you know, that kind of gets to the point of, we got to make sure we invest in communities that we don't step into the G word, that I will not say, because that's going to be a whole other conversation, gentrification, right? And so we have to be very careful when we're talking about that. There's a fine line, right? But again, these are principles. And damn it, we got to do something, because what we're doing is not sustainable. Because if it was, we wouldn't be back here with the pandemic, which exposed all the gaps that really led to this. Think about a place like Atlanta. Atlanta has the most retail spots, the most strip clubs, the most nightclubs, that in many places, including Vegas, across the whole U.S., but has one of the top 3 economic gaps when it comes between Black and white people. Educational gaps. You got a city to where right around it, the vast majority of third graders can't even pass their reading test. So we have to be forward thinking, and this community investment, they build schools and put these things in there, is one of those forward thinking mechanisms. Now, this is new research that we've been working on, and we've been looking at these low income housing tax credits that HUD offers to builders to build in areas that are basically not profitable, right? And so I took that data and merged it at county level data with other crime data and things like that, using an instrument variable approach, an entropy balance instrument variable approach, where we use as the instrument variable the partisanship leanings of the county for the senatorial, the Senate, and the president's race, right? That was our instrument that worked for these projects. And what we found was that these projects, when they were placed in service, a 1% increase was associated with these things here. So we saw a reduction in reported gun assaults and robberies. It was like a 1% increase in the number of these completed projects in counties was associated with about a 7% decrease in overall gun violence rates. You saw a lower disparity in Black and white violence arrest rates. Remember, I was saying, what are things that we can do to be more effective but equitable? I think that's a point right there. Then they had race-neutral impacts on other types. So it didn't contribute to other types of disparity. And it didn't increase assaults against officers. So these types of projects show it makes people safer. Some research says, well, if you have low-income housing and you put a bunch of people who qualify for that in the area, see more increases in violence. Our research didn't see that. It did not show that whatsoever. Now, it was associated, these projects associated with increased commercialization. Well, increased commercialization is associated with increased robbery, but it wasn't gun robbery, because robbery is the one crime that usually happens between strangers, and it happens in places of leisure most of the time, right? And often intra-racial. So robbery is just a different type of crime because it's both an inquisitive crime and a violent crime. So, but those are things that the business district can do to target harden that has impacts for safety in the community. So this is not perfect, but you got to start moving down this way if you're going to cut off the ugly head of gun violence in our communities, amongst the same communities who are being ravaged by these things generation after generation. And this is my last slide here, because I really want to say, like, yes, we need focused deterrence. Yes, we need intelligence-driven policing. Yes, we need better staffing when it comes to policing. But also, let me just kind of back up. What we're seeing is this as well. It's something that's going on in our court system, that regardless of whatever the arrest disparity is, that the courts are filtering out. And so if you have a 5-to-1 arrest disparity for policing, post-arrest across the nation, Black and white people are being treated comparably. And what they're doing, they're filtering out the most egregious offenders and sending them to prison. Now, the jails could be filled, and it could be a crazy, totally different story in the jails, even though the evidence doesn't show that, that we've seen nationally. But these are just the type of things we should think about when we're talking about how can we improve public safety. All right, so that's just another side note. I'm sorry. You need focused deterrence. You need all these things. You need credible prosecutors and judges, right? Across the nation, we've been taking a more individualized approach when it comes to post-arrest, whether it's through plea bargaining, better plea bargaining deals, or whether people are being diverted or they're being sentenced, but they're given the opportunity to get good time credits if they're involved in educational programming and things like that, right? So we're doing a lot that we can do as a justice system. But if we want to move that gap closer to being 1-to-1 and not remaining at 5-to-1 with the violent offender I'm talking about in imprisonment, we're going to have to improve that environmental backlog. And by improving the environmental backlog, that means we need to bring in private partners in a way that'll make building these affordable units profitable. Because the affordable housing is one good part of it, but with these units, you see a concentration of more retail, a concentration of social services in these areas. So it's many other impacts beyond just the affordable housing. And this is what I'm saying, why I keep harping on this. My wife is doing work on the Second Chance Act. And they talk from people who were drug violators to people who were violent offenders. And Eric asked them, what do you need to succeed? I need a place to stay. And I have skills, but damn it, I need somebody who will hire me and give me a chance. And so we have to find a way to pick up those gaps. And I don't know if that's the justice system. So things like providing tax incentives to developers who will build affordable housing, to encourage small businesses to come to certain communities, to invest in education and job training and vocational programs, supporting mental health and substance abuse programs, these types of things, right? And invest in policing and outreach programs, because we have to build trust between the police and the communities that they serve. We have to also, I can have a whole other conversation talking about, well, why the police do the things that they do? Well, because the reward structure in policing really focuses on quantity, not quality. The number of arrests, not the type of arrests. The number of stops, not the type of stops. And that's how you're rewarded. That's how you get promotions. That's how you get these things. And so policing is an industry and a business, and so is the justice system. And we have to find ways to bring partners in ways that make it profitable for them, either financially or in some other way, if we really want to see the justice system be more effective, but also be more equitable in the outcomes. I hope this made sense. I shared a whole lot with you all, but these things are complex, and it requires a nuanced understanding and trying to break down these parts. So I really try to present this in a way that is digestible, but also show you the complexity of it. Also show you what's been missing in the conversation. Also show you some of the things that we need to address, like the allure of street life, the code of the street, the fear that leads to gun carrying in many of these communities, if we want to see long-term reductions in violence, and particularly gun violence, because maybe the tides will go back down naturally, but the next pandemic, the next crisis will rear its ugly head if we don't do these things. And so that's my take on what it takes to reform our justice system to increase public safety. These are many things, and mind you, many of the things that we're seeing that contributing to, for instance, 50% of the change that we saw in imprisonment disparity was due to population changes. So we need to really understand. So it's like, 50% of what happened, we can attribute to the justice system, because the Black population grew at 33% from 2000 to 2020, and the white population grew at 7%. So that's a mathematical issue. And so it also goes to where, when we're talking about these things, we just can't use rates. We have to use counts too. And when we just use race and not counts, we forget that these data points represent people. And so I think, when we're talking about this type of work, when we're doing this work and when we're presenting data and research or digesting these things, that we need to remember that these are people and that these are souls, and realizing that, yes, in criminal justice reform, we have to make sure things are constitutional. We have to make sure that defendants and those who serve their time, that they are able to be productive citizens. But we have to also make sure that we find redemption and solace for our victims and find ways to prevent victimization. So with that, I'm going to shut up. Thank you all for listening to my craziness. And if you all have any questions or want to indict anything that I say, I look forward to having a conversation and just talking about it. So I'll shut up.
All right.
sharing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. I think this is where everybody's supposed to stand up and clap, because you did not disappoint. As I said at the very beginning, I expected this to be an awesome presentation. I doubt there's anybody in the room that's going to disagree with me there. So now we're going to divert from our original plan a little bit, because we do have a relatively small group. I would ask if those of you that have some questions to help you digest or process the great deal of wonderful information that we've received here. So many different things, and some of them, as Dr. Johnson said, some of the programs he's talking about either have or are going on right here in the city of Philadelphia. For those of you that are here, I will say we have diverted a little bit. We've grown a little bit. We're recruiting people from all over the country now. So I don't know if we have some people that are not in Philadelphia, but focused deterrence has been used in Philadelphia. Right now, they're doing something, they call it something different. They call it group violence intervention. Same stuff, different day to some degree. But let's open it up. Hit the raise your hand button, and we'll acknowledge you. You can ask your question. Anyone?
I think
Francis has her hand up.
All right, go ahead, Francis.
Thank you, everyone, for seeing me. How about that? First of all, thank you very much. It was a whole lot of information, a lot to digest by no means. So I'll be looking forward to actually receiving the slides. I don't have a question. I have a comment to make. I have great nieces and my nieces and nephews have children, and that line of kids are 10 and under, right? And when I look at these brown boys, because they're Latino, I think about at their current ages, how can, and I do go volunteer at their schools and things, and they are in the city of Philadelphia, because that's, where I am and where they are as well. I want to cry and I cringe at the lack of resources, right? And, I remember a couple years back when one of the boys transitioned into a new school, and I went to orientation sessions. They pulled out a book, a catalog. I don't have children, so this is all very foreign to me. But when they pulled out a catalog and I looked, because I'm the one asking questions and researching and all sorts, I saw that their school, they're both now in there, but that school was rated the lowest in the city. And it's like, wow, you don't even have a chance when you're starting out, right? And I really do believe, and I'm originally from New York, came to Philadelphia in the mid 80s, so in the 1900s, as I say. And I remember how I even experienced that transition coming into the school system here in Philadelphia, right? So I don't see that anything or a lot has changed, although yes, there are new programs and I see things, but at the same time, I don't see things, right? And I'm a firm believer, all that to say that we need to tap into these, the children much sooner to prevent or to lessen the chances of them landing in all of these, and being statistics included in the information you shared with us, right? And I don't know, because again, and I've attended some of the sessions here where we don't have access to IT in the way some of the communities do, right? So when one of your slides, you're talking about, the very last ones, and you talk about the work and the opportunities for work and training and all that sort of thing, it's like we are already still, again, behind steps, right? Based on technology alone, right? I'm affected. Any one of us here could be affected by technology and AI alone, right? So it's like these things that it's just scary across the board. And while, again, we see changes, programs, and so on and so forth. And yeah, that G word, whole nother conversation. So again, my 5 cents, and thank you again for all of the information.
No, I mean, that was definitely worth more than 5 cents. And, Natasha, I know she's on, if you want to hop in, but, one thing that, my research started in the master's program, school to prison pipeline, and how can we buffer that? And it kind of opened my eyes up to things. And Natasha, she worked in the school system with special education students. And, it started breaking my heart to seeing not only do they come from marginalized communities, but oftentimes these students have IEPs. They are been labeled special education. I think it's something of the vast majority of people in prison that dropped out. We look at juveniles, I think it's well over 50% had an IEP on their record. And so it's like those, so that's the group that, you know, what did we start at? My God, that's the most vulnerable group right there, right? And so, you know, that's a really hard question, but that's why it's important that we can't expect the police to arrest our way out of these issues. And we have to provide a future for those who are younger, because all we're doing, the way things are going, are creating a steady stock of people to fill our prisons, a steady stock of people to keep everybody with job security in the criminal justice system. And I don't want to get into, like, you know, I'm this negative person, this and then, and you know, this conspiratorial, but those are issues that we have to address. And look, we always say we don't have money for these things. And I call people I call them, and I go talk to governors, and look, I'm saying these things. I'm not just saying it, I'm talking stuff to y'all. But I say, listen, I know states across the U.S. waste about $5 to $15 billion annually just on stuff, the local government. I know that about $50 billion, which is a GDP of some countries, is wasted on Medicare and healthcare fraud. So if I've already told you about $65 billion that we can take right there, we better use these things. And not to mention, you know, many people in these, I'm going to get in trouble, but many people in these communities that are impacted the most by community violence, we see a lot of aid packets going to other countries. And we're like, well, what about us? And there's other reasons for it that's well beyond, and just, I acknowledge that. But when people see these things in these communities, or you have teachers like Natasha who's teaching 6th, 7th, and 8th graders and using a 5th grade Russian math book because we don't have enough books, we got a problem with prioritizing. And so, no, you're absolutely right. And I wish I had the answers to it, but unless we start there, I mean, hell, things like the DARE program, we stopped the DARE program because it didn't reduce drugs. But the one thing that it did was it made police and the juveniles have a better relationship. And maybe we can start bringing those types of programs instead of just, or how we use SROs. That's another issue that I'm way above my pay grade, but how we utilize our services when we deal with students, you know, how we utilize police service when you deal with juveniles, and what options do we have? Can you talk about these referrals that you have, like at places like Denver for drugs and mental health and these things? Those are using referrals for adults. Juveniles are generally left out of that. And so, I mean, I'm not really answering, but yeah, that's something I struggle with all the time. So thank you. Natasha, do you want to hop in?
I'm happy to hop in. I definitely want to say that this is an opportunity to reinforce the fact that we're not talking about separate agencies, you know, police versus community versus our youth versus other systems, but that we really all do have a role to play in moving this needle forward, and we all have to care. And the good news is, right, with all the money that is currently being wasted in other sectors, for example, the good news is that we're not talking about anything that requires more time, more energy, more money to be a better agent, to be a better ally. Like, we all have a role to play. And the good news is that the opportunities definitely exist. You know, the harvest is ripe, the laborers are few. That tends to continue to be true. And just the part of the moving the needle forward involves these same conversations here, and this same level of agency and this same level of activism, and just caring, just showing up. You can't show out if you don't show up, right? And then these are the ways in which we move the needle forward. And as usual, it's not some kind of major event. It usually tends to happen incrementally, and then this is part of the steps and the action that we have to take to, again, move this needle forward.
No, great points, and I'll move on, Frank. But I will say, you know, the one thing I add to what you said, Natasha, and also as well, Francis, is the fact that, you know, when we think about the school to prison pipeline and that what are teachers supposed to do, right? There, you have 40 students in the class. You have one that's disruptive. You're not resourced enough. You spent your own money probably for the things they're using in class, you know, and so we have to do a better job of resourcing our people. You know, we ask the criminal justice system, nonprofits, and all these other our educational systems to do a whole lot with a whole lot less, and we ask them to do a lot with less and less each year. You know, so we just gotta, as a society, get our priorities together. And I mean, I think you know, Frank, I'm gonna kind of move on. I see Michael's first. Hi, Michael, how you doing, man? I see him with a question asking, where does the police department start if the political body may be unwilling to go the routes that's offered? And, you know, and I think that's a really important question. And that's why I always say these things are bigger than police and the justice system. And I see you, Ivy, I'll come to you next. The justice system is the fact that, for instance, oftentimes police departments are judged based on the number of clearances. The budgets are judged on the number of arrests, the number of citations, right? The reported crimes, calls for service. But there are other ways, and police are often judged based on about 15% of the job. 15% of the job is the crime fighting stuff. That community stuff y'all want us to do, the proactive patrolling and things, that's the other 85% that we don't get rewarded for, that they don't really have incentives for. And so what I'm saying is it can be really, really hard. I mean, I'll tell you a story. I remember we were working in the precinct, in the zone, and we had a bunch of break-ins, man. And so we saturated that spot. We saturated. We caught a few people, and next thing, or either we pushed them out, whatever it was. We had the next couple of weeks, we had no reports. Well, Comstat came out the next month, went in, and we got in trouble. Like, y'all not writing enough reports or making enough arrests. So what the hell do you mean? The crime rates are down, right? And so oftentimes things in policing are counterintuitive to what real public safety looks like. And you have people making decisions at the higher level who don't know what the hell is going on the street or dealing with police. And so if we talk about the political body, it's really, really hard. But I will say, you have sometimes states have state funding and programs. Sometimes the federal government has federal funding and programs that you can get these resources and get things that are allocated. You can receive these training that's a no cost. But then you got the economics and logistics of policing. You want to get your officers trained. Well, if you're already short staffed, who are you going to pull off the street? You're going to pay somebody overtime? You know, so these are even things about governance that when we start thinking about how do we improve the different branches of the justice system, how can we just do it practically? And I think the political will is, I don't have an answer to it, but you can have somebody like me come in and talk to your government officials and show them the data, lay the data out, bring in other experts who do these things for a living, who are willing to do these things. But that's no guarantee. One thing that we've been finding out that we need to also educate the public, because what I'm finding out is at some point, people have skin in the game who are elected officials, they want to be reelected. But to be reelected, you at least have to throw a bone out to the people who elected you. And oftentimes what we'll see is that elected officials will do things, not because they're benevolent, they got skin in the game, and their constituents was wanted. And so I think that voters don't understand the power in their vote, but unfortunately, many of us are undereducated when it comes about the prosecutor who we're voting for. Many of us are undereducated when it comes for the sheriffs, or when it comes to the judges that we're voting for. And so a big part of it is, you know, if you're a police department, you're advocating for these things, bring somebody like me down to advocate to your public. Bring somebody like me down to testify to your city council. Bring somebody like me down to walk people through the data and try to find sensible ways based on what's a custom for you. And so I'm not the savior of it, and there are people much smarter than me, but these are ways that I've seen some locales overcome that reticence or even just the ambivalence about taking a community or holistic approach when people and levels of crime are higher than they've been, even when crime was really, really, really bad back in the 90s. And so probably to answer your question is to just, I do acknowledge the issue and there are ways to navigate it, but you have to give them abundance of evidence. And unfortunately, you have some leaders who be hitting right in the face to their blue with evidence, and they still won't make that change. And that's where it goes to your public, and you try to educate them. But these things are not overnight, unfortunately. And yeah, I don't really have an answer that's, make us feel good. It just kind of shows us a level of work and my willingness, and people who do the things that we do, willingness to engage and at least be that person to come in. Because this is the thing too, and I shut up. Just like with family, right? Now, tell me if you all, I go out and get this doctorate and all this stuff, and people still, and my family still, your family still tend to cite other people or friends. You have to bring a stranger in sometimes for people to listen to, and maybe, I've seen that as well. And so, no, absolutely. Engage, expose, and inform. You're right, Francis. Absolutely. All right. I'm sorry about this long-winded. Ivy, I know you had your hand up, so,
First of all, thank you so much. I've learned so much. I love anybody that brings me a bunch of statistics. I love them. You back everything up with statistics, right? I love it. So I can't wait to look at those slides. Kind of two questions now that you were kind of talking a bit more. The first one that just kind of came to me was, are we bringing the offenders to the table and asking them what their input is in how to avoid, how to be part of the solution. Because, it seems like that voice is incredibly important in this discussion. And so I was curious if anybody is, if you know if they've been part of the discussion. And part two is with group intervention, I think you called it, it was a really interesting approach. I love that idea of kind of getting the community involved. But my question on that was, do you get victim buy-in? Has there been discussion or input from the victims in that approach, and do they feel a certain way? That's it. So if you could address those, thank you.
No, Abby, that is, I'm taking notes because my God, those are really good questions. And so, let me start with the second and then move my way to the offenders, because I'm going to draw on Natasha's work and maybe ask her, if she wants to share, if she can please share. So when it comes to the victims, we're finding that a lot of cities are considering using a restorative justice model, and the restorative justice model that victims and survivors, they drive that, right? And and I will say, I hear these. I believe in accountability. Like, I'm one of those guys, right? Some, I don't know if I'm conservative, if I'm left leaning. I don't know what the hell I am. I just go for truth and right. But accountability is truth and right. And so restorative justice, actually, to me, people continue to serve their time, but they have to be held to account and have excuse the language, I'm a Southern boy in Baptist church, a come to Jesus moment, right? Sometimes. And so, what I found with that, when it comes to restorative justice, that has been really successful. The issue is, it's hard to scale that up. It's a slower process, right? It involves building relationships and trust and things like that. But when you talk about victims and survivors, the one things that they've been voicing, and victim right groups have been voicing, that they want to see the type of route that I'm going for, that I'm talking about. They want to see the cut off, because they don't want to see this happen to other people. They get through their anger, they get through their hurt, and then what they'll come around to is that people who may have asked for the death penalty, we don't want to do that. People who are asking for life, that's not going to bring them back. And what happened is 2 lives got destroyed. Now, man, you got a bigger heart, and man, woo, you're better than me, right? Because woo, I don't know if I have that spirit. But you've seen that with victims' rights groups and survivors across the nation. You start having an argument about, how long do offenders should they serve, and when do we consider offenders, or particularly violent offenders, to have reached redemption? So that's one thing we're seeing with the victims. And the one thing I'm glad you asked that question about, because the one thing that kind of gets on my nerve when we're talking about reform, we're talking about the offenders. Listen, everybody is innocent to proven guilty. You serve a time and all these things, but damn it, we can't forget about the victims and their survivors. And oftentimes that is often left out. And so I think, states are starting to realize that, but not quite sure how to broach it, because you're asking a lot of victims and survivors. And so that's real touchy. But you've seen them leaning in the way of more merciful, rehabilitative types of punishments, as opposed to just throwing away the key or putting them in a chair. Now, we talk about the offenders. Go ahead. No, we're talking.
I was going to say, my quick thought on that was, because you don't want to do exactly what you're trying to avoid with the offenders. You don't want to do with the victims, which is to have them not trust, right? So that's why I was curious of the approach. So I appreciate
that's a really great question, and it's one that I'm not asked enough, right? Honestly. And then we talk about the offenders. No, the focus of deterrence, it brings offenders to the table and involves the whole community. But when you talk about, when I was speaking on the Second Chance Act and that work, generally the people go through, nobody's like, oh, it's the system's fault. I got railroaded. People tend to hold accountability, but they tend to be very pessimistic about their future options and prospects. And so the one reoccurring theme that came up for the Second Chance Act interviews that they were doing, this was not about housing and working. It was not about that. That was a reoccurring theme amongst all the interviewees, is that we need work, we effed up, but we paid our debt. When do we stop paying our debt? And that's kind of what we're hearing from the offenders. And even the work that I talked about, the allure of the street life and some of those things, that was drawn from work that we worked with Richard Wright on, who interviewed active offenders, right? So when I was saying things about them not being rational, actual robbery offenders, because even things like, he asked the question, aren't you afraid of being victimized yourself? And they were like, listen, sometimes you get got, you got to charge the game. It is what it is, right? I just figured out a way to get mine. So they're not thinking rationally. And so what we're finding with offenders, many of them want a way out, but they don't feel like they have a way out. And so that's really what we're hearing when it comes to the role of offenders. The good thing that we're seeing a move back to in the prisons, we're seeing that they're reestablishing good time credits. They're reestablishing diversionary approaches that require not only accountability, but for you to go to some type of training, some type of therapy, and these types of things. And so we are seeing a move toward that approach. We're seeing the courts move away from just punishing drug offenders and property offenders to focusing on, violence. States like oh my God, even places like Georgia, right? States saw that they were maybe a little bit too harsh or unfair in some of their penalties, and they went back and had amendments to correct some laws. And so you're seeing both at the state level, but at the offenders, and everybody really trying to come to understand it, but also recognizing how difficult it is. And again, it's difficult when there's no cookie cutter approach. Say, here, take this and just drop it in there and it works. But yeah, I think, more research coming out giving voice to offenders as well humanizes them. So I think oftentimes they're not humanized. And so, yeah, I think that's at least the spirit that we're kind of see how states are moving toward dealing with offenders. They're recognizing we just can't lock up and we run out of room. They're recognizing that, and they're making moves again, not because of benevolence, but more because of economics and industrial types of decision making. Well, thank you so much, Ivy. And what did it say? And Natasha said, in the recidivism, thank you. There was an overwhelming thing that really jumped out to me. These people wanted an opportunity, not a handout, right? They wanted redemption, not reparation. And so, this shows that people want to do better. And oftentimes people, they're making irrational decisions in the moment they commit these crimes. Now you have bad actors, mind you, but that's not the standard profile.
All right. We have any, I don't see any other hands up, but is there anybody that has another burning question you want to throw in there? And we had an extra benefit. We had 2-for-1 show with the Doctors Johnson. I really appreciate Natasha chiming in. And thank you so very much. And all the great comments from everybody. And I want to thank my own coworkers for their support, including Dr. Rita Tolliver-Roberts, Mike Agnello, Ivy Kemp for her help, Chris Campbell, Sharon Walker, any other folks that showed up, and of course, all of you that joined us tonight, and anybody who might watch this later because the video will be available. So I want to thank everybody. As Dr. Thad Johnson said, we will have the PDF available for you of his slides. Video will also be, we'll have a link to the video for you that attended. There was a few people that actually asked ahead of time for certificates, which is something we haven't normally done in the past, but our marketing folks created one for me, so I can send it to somebody who needs one for your continuing education or whatever. There is, and I'll add it again so it's prominent. There is a post-event survey we'd like you to take and give us any comments about the event. And also, lastly, unless anybody else has a comment to make, I want you to pay attention to the calendar coming up. In the spring, we're looking to do another part of our crime and public health series that we started last spring. That's between the criminal justice program and our health administration program. We are going to be looking at how we're dealing with the drug problem, primarily in the city of Philadelphia, and how can we better address it or combine the efforts of law enforcement and public health folks, which is going on right now. And I think, Thad mentioned it a little bit as well. So look forward to that. We're start working on that actually right now. I'm meeting with someone next week, and hopefully we'll have that information out to you very shortly. So thank you all very much for attending. It's been a pleasure as usual. I got exactly what I expected out of Dr. Johnson and Johnson. And so I appreciate you coming to join us so very much. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
night, y'all.
And